My recorder froze up on me on my last class, my upper division class on Friday. So I'm hoping it doesn't do it today. Uh, Remember that you shouldn't count on the recordings because sometimes we do get these technical glitches that I can't control, and that you should be taking notes directly here. We were talking about neoclassicism, this movement that began in the wake of the Rococo movement, and it began primarily in France, but we'll see it's really everywhere in the later part of the 18th century. And on a certain level, neoclassicism is directly a reaction to the Rococo, right? The Rococo period had been aristocrats playing, and had been sort of frivolous subject matter depicted in a kind of Rubens-inspired, exuberant style, right? It'd been candy for the eyes in a way. And neoclassicism is much, much more serious. And what we'll see on Thursday is it's one of two movements that react to the Rococo that are deeply, deeply serious. And that has to do with the Enlightenment, right? And the idea in studying history to improve your mind, to make you a better citizen. And all of our Enlightenment philosophers in France were advocating studying history for lessons to help us improve our community, which led, of course, to the American Revolution in 1776 and to the French Revolution in 1789, right? And which is the idea that we are, as citizens, have responsibility to the community and that we are all equal, right? We all deserve liberty. These are all elements that come out of Enlightenment philosophy. And so one of the things that Voltaire and others are recommending is that we study history to give us lessons for how to navigate the modern world. And the Oath of the Sons of Horatius is a scene that is intended to do exactly that, to look back to 7th century BC, the foundations of the Republic of Rome, as a lesson for the importance of fighting for a higher cause, putting your personal interests aside for the good of the community. Horatius' sons are swearing to fight to the death against their mortal enemy. The daughter in the lower right corner with the blue turban, secretly engaged to one of the enemy's sons, and she's not going to stop them, right? She's going to sacrifice her own personal happiness for the good of the community. And in 1785, when this was first shown, it was painted in 1784, shown to the public for the first time in 1785, it was intended as a rallying cry for some of the ideals that are leading us now toward the French Revolution 4 years later. And indeed, immediately following the French Revolution, this picture was shown a second time at a major exhibition. Every 2 years, the Royal Academy sponsors the Salon, where painters exhibit their newest and best works, juried, right, by the leaders of the Royal Academy. And this was shown a second time. The jurors decided to put it up again in 1789, right after the Revolution. And immediately adjacent to a huge painting that David was actually working on that showed the leaders of the Revolution swearing to fight, right? The past as a model for the present, past actions. At the same time, neoclassicism is a very studied style, intricately worked out, not a lot of flamboyance, very kind of restrained, a sort of revival of Poussin as opposed to Rubens. Everything horizontal and vertical, locked into space. 3 suns, 3 arches, 3 swords, 3 women, right? Everything repeated throughout the composition that gives it this sort of meticulously crafted, for my money, almost lifeless quality, right? The other thing that we see often in neoclassicism is the idea of looking to past art and consciously quoting famous works of art to make your point. So in the year of the terror, when the leaders of the revolution, David is close to the leaders of the revolution. He's on the front lines of social change during this time, right? He's a member of the Jacobin party, the Jacobins, the most extreme revolutionary group. And when they are advocating for beheadings, and there are tens of thousands of beheadings in just a few months, David gets a commission to make a painting that will be distributed through prints and copies that show that the revolutionaries had also been attacked, had also suffered. Marat, the journalist, the advocate for the common man, assassinated in his ointment bath, helpless, right? And only assassinated for his ideas, for the idea that we are all equal, right? That every man has the same rights. This got him killed by a royalist, right? And David, to make him into something greater than just a journalist who's murdered, uses images of Christ to amplify the idea that he is a martyr for us all, right? Just as Christ died for our sins, Marat died for the rights of the common man, right? And he loves Caravaggio, he loves Michelangelo, he uses these images as more or less the inspiration for the pose he chooses for the death of Marat. So, David right on the front lines of things, right? Deeply engaged with this extraordinarily tumultuous period of French history. He was also friends with Napoleon, going back to Napoleon's earliest career as a general, right? And here we see Napoleon at the end of his role as a general. So while the French Revolution is happening and while the terror is going on and they're sorting this out, Napoleon is a general for the French army. And he is primarily around the Mediterranean, fighting numerous battles, particularly on the eastern fringe of the Mediterranean, the southern fringe of the Mediterranean. He goes into Palestine, not Israel yet, right? Goes into Africa, right? Deeply engaged in sort of spreading the French Empire, if you will, spreading the French colonialism into the Middle East. And in 1799, there was a military coup, and Napoleon is elected into office, asked to come home to hang up his military uniform, if you will, and take on the reins of government as the first consul of France, right? He's going to be the first really elected leader of France after the revolution, okay? And the whole idea is he's going to be an elected leader in the same way that, the Roman Republic prior to the empire had elected its leaders. It was going to be a democracy. It's going to work out, right? And we all know what happened. In 1803, right? Napoleon declares himself emperor. Goes from being first consul, an appointed post, to emperor, a post for life, right? And he decides that he wants this to follow in the footsteps of great emperors of the past. And he models his leadership as emperor. And this is now still 3 years after this image, right? 2-3 years after this image. He models his ideal of leadership after the Roman emperors of antiquity, the second phase of Roman history, when it's not elective government, right? When it's inherited government taken by force. That's going to be one of the models of his leadership. The other model of his leadership is going to be the Holy Roman Emperors of the Middle Ages. And so as Napoleon declares himself emperor, he's going to get crowned. He's going to take the imperial crown, or have one made for him, right, and have it put on his head. And so in the medieval tradition, he invites the Pope to come and crown him. just as the popes had done with the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, normally in the Middle Ages, the emperor would go to Rome to receive the crown, but Napoleon makes the pope come to him in Paris, right? So he's not going to bow down to anybody, right? If he goes to Rome, that means it's like the pope called him down, right? And he answers, so he's in charge of all of this, right? And the other thing he does when he's crowned, right, is the pope is coming, he's about to put the crown on Napoleon's head. And do you know this story, what he did? If he receives the crown from the emperor, then it's a gift from the emperor, and he only has the crown because the emperor says it's okay. No, I'm sorry, the pope. That Monday morning, right? Back up. If he takes the crown from the pope, then he only has the crown because the pope has sanctioned it, right? The pope thinks this has said this, put his blessing on this, right? So if he waits and lets the pope put the crown on his head, then the pope could conceivably take it back, right? Because it's a gift from the pope, sanctioned by the pope. So what he does is, rather problematically, as the pope is about to put the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon reaches up and grabs it from him and puts it on his own head, right? No one crowns me, I crown myself, right? So Napoleon ends up as this, starts off as sort of the aftermath of the revolution, right? He's going to be the first appointed leader that's not a king, right? With a term and appointed by the will of the people. Not really a vote, right? But appointed by a council as the will of the people. And what happens is the French had a revolution against the king, and they wound up with an emperor, right? Instead of just a French king who's involved with France, somebody who has designs on ruling all of Europe, right? And be careful what you, right, fight for. Is an issue. So David knows Napoleon going back to his time as general, right? They had met in the 1790s, 1794 or so. And after Napoleon comes back to become first consul, and before he's become emperor, he commissions a picture from David that again is made with the idea of making copies, right? Multiple painted variations of this composition, plus prints, engravings, and etchings made after it for distribution. And it's Napoleon coming home to take up the reins of government, right? That happened in 1799. This is now 1801. Notice, by the way, that we have contemporary political events being illustrated here, right? Relatively rare earlier on. Think of Rubens and how allegorical those Marie de Medici pictures were, right? This is a fairly direct image of things that happened. Part of the reason we think about this is modern painting in a way. Interest in the modern world. And here he is coming home, right? Now, David wants to again make this image extraordinary, right? He wants to make the event like Marie de Medici coming to Italy. He wants to make it overblown, but he doesn't give us images of victory figures in the air or allegorical figures, but at the same time, there's this sense that Napoleon is being swept. The wind is at his back as he crosses the Alps from Italy back to France, right? And it's almost like nature itself is pushing him home. That the call that has been given for Napoleon to come back and reign is a call from nature itself. And so he's looking at us calm. This is totally a construction. We know that he was riding a mule, not a horse, for example, right? And David gives us this extraordinarily strong horse, right? Pushing its way forward. As Napoleon looks as calm as can be, despite the fact that the horse is rearing up, right? He's controlling it. He's totally in charge of the scene. And if you look in detail, right, the horse is spitting and whinnying and rearing up, and yet Napoleon's reins are slack. Right? He's not pulling back at the horse to get it rear up. He's making it do it with his mind. Right? He's willing the horse to do this. And the horse is obeying him almost telepathically. Right? It's doing what he wants without him having to try too hard. And that's part of the message that David is trying to get across. Right? This is a force of nature. It's a force of will. Napoleon is greater than all of this. And we see his little troops behind him going up the pathway. He's leading them forward, even though he's behind them. Right? And down in the foreground, we see that he's carved his name into a rock, a little graffiti in the Alps, right? And we also see that two other people had carved their names into the rock at the exact same pass. These are historical figures: Hannibal and Charlemagne, Carolus Magnus. Great leaders of the past that Napoleon is modeling himself after. Hannibal from ancient Rome, Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Now Napoleon joins their ranks. Right? So this is total pictorial propaganda. Right? Showing us Napoleon being swept by nature back to France to give them his strong leadership. That leadership, that strength of leadership, symbolized through how he controls a horse without physical means, and how he's joining the ranks of these great leaders of the past. And this is even before he's been crowned the new emperor of Rome. It shows us his ambitions, right? Again, typical for neoclassical art is a referencing of past art, particularly art from classical periods, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, the Renaissance, are touch points for neoclassical artists. And Napoleon's calm demeanor in the saddle of a rearing horse can be traced right back to a very famous set of statues, sculptures from the Parthenon in Athens, that also showed the people of Athens riding these rearing horses, but again, utterly unconcerned, and certainly controlling it, as it will, mentally as much as anything. Here's Napoleon post-coronation at the National Gallery, an over-life-size portrait of Napoleon now 8 years into his reign as emperor, and he's still dressed as a general. He's still having himself portrayed as a military man, right? He's not wearing his imperial robes. However, he does have an imperial throne next to him. There's an extraordinary table, which we'll see other examples of coming up. And here we see him rising to greet us, if you will, rising to look out. And what David is trying to show us with this image is Napoleon as the man who's working hard for France. Napoleon is the one who will do anything to help the success of his country. And he fills this picture with a bunch of little clues that amplify the overall meaning of the piece. If we look right behind him, we see that there are candles on the table, a lamp. And you'll notice that the candles are burning down very low. There's place for 3 different candles. Only one of them is still burning. The other 2 have burned out. This suggests that he's been working for a very long time, right? He lit those candles new, and now they've burned their way out because he's been working for so very long. The fact that they're candles suggests that this is the nighttime, that he's actually worked all the way through the night. What's he been working on? He's been writing. And we can see directly next to him a quill pen that has been dipped in ink. On his opposite side, a sword. Again, that juxtaposition of the pen and the sword, a common theme that we see in paintings from the early 19th century, right? Numerous paintings. We can read the clock on the wall. Come on. Wi-Fi, there we go. It's 4:12, 4:13 in the morning, right? Napoleon has worked his way through the night. He's crammed for his finals, I guess, right? And here he's rising now. His clothes are rumpled. His hair is kind of mussed up. He's been up all night working, and now he's about to go out and review the troops. In his hand, he carries a small gold box. It's a snuff box. We think of snuff box now for chewing tobacco, but the stuff that they put in their mouths in the 19th century had a little bit of cocaine in it as well. Kept you up all night, right? It was laced. Snuff was, right? A slight narcotic in it that would keep you vibrant. So that's part of him staying up all night. We see on his throne bees. Those are Napoleon's imperial symbol. He adopted the bee as his imperial symbol, right? The reason he adopted is it looks an awful lot like the fleur-de-lis, the old French royal symbol, but he's translated it now, right? He's inherited that, but he's different. And we also see in our detail on the right what he's been working on. The code, the Napoleonic code of law. He's working on something that's for the benefit of all people, right? And up all night before reviewing the troops to go to do this, to sacrifice. Again, David wants him to seem larger than life. He wants him to seem perfected in some way. He's going to turn back and look at ancient art again for his prototypes. And the pose that Napoleon has is the traditional contrapposto pose that we saw so often in the Renaissance. Right? That is an ideal pose, an idealized pose. It's a pose that was used for images of perfection. Michelangelo's David, right? Roman emperors, Greek gods appeared in the contrapposto pose. Now Napoleon does as well. He's the perfect leader by borrowing this pose. Now Napoleon loves ancient Rome, right? It's kind of the single most favored period of history because he's putting himself forward as the inheritor of that legacy, right? He's an emperor of the 19th century in the mold of the emperors of ancient Rome. He had come back from Italy. That was part of the area that he had conquered for the French. Italy is under French control at this particular point. He is the inheritor of ancient Rome. And the tables are flipped, right? The Roman emperors had conquered France back under Augustus, the first Roman emperor. They called it Gaul. In this case, the French emperors conquered Italy. It's still the same empire, right? But the focal points changed. France has conquered Italy. And when Napoleon commissions buildings, his favorite touch point, his favorite inspiration for those buildings are Roman buildings. I'm only going to show you two examples. The Arc de Triomphe in Paris, right, was begun by Napoleon as a monument to his military victories. And he had it put up on the Champs-Élysées for French troops to walk through as they returned victoriously to Paris. That triumphal arch idea is a Roman idea. There are triumphal arches everywhere in Rome, right? At the Forum, there are 3 that still stand. This is the Arch of Titus, right? The Emperor Titus put it up to welcome his troops returning from a victorious battle in Palestine, outside of Jerusalem. Actually, the conquering of Jerusalem was part of this, right? So the triumphal arch idea is revived by Napoleon in Paris. Again, he's creating a new Rome, right? On the right, he has a temple built to honor the military fallen, the dead of Napoleon's army. And he has the building modeled directly on Roman architectural types, which we see in the center. This is the Maison Carrée, which is actually in France, but was put up by the Romans when they had controlled France. These are the prototypes for Napoleon. Everywhere he looks, he's eating up, digesting, spitting out Roman monuments, right? And again, that's part and parcel of neoclassicism. There's another element of Napoleon that's worthwhile talking about here. While he was in the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean, all right, on his military campaigns in the 1790s, he also conquered Egypt. Right? He had conquered, for the French, most of Palestine, had conquered Italy. Right? He had also conquered Egypt. And this is a sort of romantic picture many years after Napoleon's death, showing him encountering the Sphinx in the desert. Right? So just as Napoleon loves Roman emperors because they are absolute leaders, right? They are totalitarian powers, which is what his ambition is. Napoleon also loves pharaohs because pharaohs are also totalitarian powers, right? And in the ancient world, both the Roman emperors and the pharaohs put themselves to the people as the embodiment of God, the personal representative and even the descendant of the gods. Now, Napoleon doesn't go quite that far, but definitely by using the contrapposto pose for his official imagery, he becomes perfected. He becomes idealized. He becomes godlike. Right? So Napoleon loves ancient Egypt every bit as much as he loves ancient Rome. And this leads to a number of architectural designs that sort of are quasi-Egyptian under Napoleon's reign and beyond. We get this sort of interest in sphinxes. And they're not specifically Egyptian, but they're just kind of weirdly Egyptian. So if you look at the table in our portrait, right, you can see those sphinx feet down below. That's coming from this growing interest in the Middle East at the same time, right? As there's an interest in ancient Rome. It all comes from Napoleon's own exploits. And we're going to look at this for a little bit, this interest in the Middle East. Because in French art in the early part of the 19th century, there is this extraordinary sidetrack of paintings that become interested in Middle Eastern culture. And one of the more famous images along this line is the Grand Odalisque by Ingres. Ingres was a pupil of Jacques-Louis David. Almost every painter in the 19th century seems to have studied under Jacques-Louis David at one point or another. And Ingres' Odalisque is one of his more famous works. Does anybody know what an Odalisque is? What that term means? Odalisque. She's a harem girl. She's a member of the Sultan's bevy of women that he keeps around for sexual favor. Right? And the Grand Odalisque is a very, very large picture. Right? And it shows us a very, very privileged view. The harem of the Sultan was off view to outsiders. Only the Sultan was allowed inside the harem, with the exception of the guards, all of whom were eunuchs. They were castrated, so they couldn't take advantage of the women in the harem. And so we become the Sultan. We become this privileged viewer of an inside private space that's exotic, sumptuous, eroticized. Right? And this interest that we see in Ingres, in the furniture under Napoleon, we've come to call Orientalism. This is the Western Europe's interest in a sort of fantasized Middle East. Not particularly accurate, very selective in what it chooses to show us. Right? And in this case, the image that it chooses, and we'll talk more about this with another Ingres, is an image of eroticism, depicted with extraordinary realism, with the exception, of course, of her anatomy, which just doesn't work, right? Try to connect the back knee with the hip. and see where that thigh has to go to line up properly. But still, it's about sensuality. The fur, the underneath her hips. There's also a fur-lined robe that she's not wearing on the left. Jewels, a hookah pipe that's smoking, the feather fan. It's extraordinarily elegant, right? And extraordinarily sensual in that it inspires touch, right? This is part of Orientalism, is that seems to be a very selective interest in Middle Eastern culture amongst the people in France. And that selection seems to be based entirely on images that put into very stark contrast the difference between European Christian culture or Enlightenment culture and Middle Eastern Islamic culture. Right? Saying that they are different from us, they're more exotic than we are. But also the images that seem to be chosen are images that suggest that European culture is more civilized. And even though this is elegant and exotic and refined, it's also bigamist, it's eroticized, it's decadent. This is not Aang's fault. This is the ideology of the time that is trying to assert, as Napoleon is out conquering parts of the Middle East, trying to assert the degree to which Western culture is better. And doing it through images that focus on one or two different kinds of themes that suggest that Middle Eastern culture needs the civilizing force of the West. And I would argue that we do that today, that we tend to latch onto images of other cultures to suggest that they're more evil and they either need to be kept separate from us or they need our civilizing influence. This is not intended to be a rounded picture of what life in the Middle East was like. It's a very selective imagery, okay? Supporting the ideology of colonization. Now, this particular picture, a little bit about Aang. He was a pupil of Jacques-Louis David in 1801 at the Salon, right? So the French Academy, the Royal Academy sponsored, and they're still called the Royal Academy, by the way, even though the royalty's gone, right, under Napoleon. The Royal Academy, in addition to sponsoring the Salon, gave out prizes. So there were jurors' prizes that they gave to the best pictures in the show, right? And one of them was for really best painting overall. At the student show that went up on Friday, we gave out jurors' prizes to 4 of the artists from the that had put in works that we thought were just absolutely outstanding, right? We gave them a little prize. 2 of them were not even art majors, right? Which was kind of cool, right? They're coming in, they're doing really great work. And that was not part of our decision-making process. It just worked out that way, right? In the Salon, one of the highest prizes you could get was the Prix de Rome, the Rome Prize. And Aang won this in 1801. Jacques-Louis David never did. Apparently, it really ate at him that he never won the Prix de Rome. But the Prix de Rome was terrific. Our prizes were like a $50 gift certificate to Dick Blick, because that's what we can afford, right? Carved out of my budget for this. The Prix de Rome was 2 years in Rome, all expenses paid, right? And the idea for neoclassical France, go to Rome, see ancient Roman ruins, see Italian Renaissance art, go to the Sistine Chapel, right? See Raphael's frescoes, go visit the Forum, see the Arch of Titus, right? Spend 2 years soaking it up. Come back to France a better painter, right? Well, when Aang wins this prize in 1801, Italy had been conquered by Napoleon. It's a colony of France from the 1890s through the end of Napoleon's reign, 1815. 1790s, 1815. And when Eng goes there, there are tons of Italians living in Italy because it's now a French colony. Sorry, number of Italians. I'm having trouble with my words this morning. A number of French there. There's a number. Yeah, guess what I learned in art class today? There's a lot of Italians living in Italy. A lot of French were living in Italy because Napoleon had conquered Italy. I almost said conquered France. And Napoleon had conquered Italy in the 1790s. Right? And what Eng found is that there's a lot of people for whom he can work and with whom he can converse, right, in French. And he stays there for like 20 years, right, working for all of these French patrons that are living in Italy under Napoleon's reign, right? He even stays there after the downfall of Napoleon. So this picture from 1814 is, 12 years after his Rome Prize has expired. He's still living in Italy. And it was actually painted for Napoleon's sister, right, who was a local countess there, right? So this is for her collection, right? So that's an important thing to think about, is that he's down in Italy while he paints this. And he's there specifically to go look at Renaissance art, to go look at ancient art. And the pose that he uses for the odalisque is modeled loosely after a painting by Titian. Trying to get the Wi-Fi is being sluggish. There we go. A painting by Titian that was very, very well known in the 16th century and onward. Titian is a painter's painter. Throughout the ages, we find artists responding to Titian again and again and again. Whether it's Velázquez, or Rubens, or Van Dyck on the one hand. I didn't show it to you. You can argue with Rembrandt's getting stuff from him. And now Eng as well. The Venus of Urbino is not Venus at all. This was painted for the Duke of Urbino, and she's a courtesan, she's a prostitute. And this is meant for his private viewing. It picked up the nickname, the Venus of Urbino, to make it safe, to make it tolerable. If it's an image of a prostitute, right, then it becomes a little bit scarier, becomes riskier when it's on public view, right? And Eng sees this picture and he uses it as the basis for his. He understands what it is, that she is in fact a prostitute receiving you, the viewer, as a client. You brought her some flowers, right? The dog, the symbol of fidelity, is asleep because you're visiting a prostitute, right? The women in the back are either getting clothes for her or putting her clothes away, right? She's naked, not nude. Nude figures don't. Michelangelo's David never wore clothes, right? There's this sense that that's the way he's supposed to be. He's nude, right? But a naked figure suggests that this is not the way he's supposed to be. And with the Titian, and this was recognized. I'm sorry, this is going to get a little embarrassing, right? But look at the position of her hand. What's she up to? Right? Mark Twain saw this picture. He said it was the most disgusting thing he'd ever seen in his life. Because it looks as if she's masturbating. Touching her own genitalia. And this is what he's using as a source. Right? An extraordinarily secular, extraordinarily erotic picture from the Renaissance. Right? We in class looked at the Venus picture by him. We looked at music makers in the countryside, and they also had a sort of sensual quality about them. This is what Eng now is importing into the odalisque, and he's making a modern version of that, imported with all of its eroticism. And this is one of a number of pictures that Eng did that used Titian as the basis for these orientalizing images of eroticism. Okay? And he continued to do these throughout his incredibly long career. Eng's still around in the 1860s. And on the left, well after Napoleon's departure, Napoleon's out of the scene now for 25 years, he gives us another image of an odalisque, right, with her slave, with her eunuch, in the harem, another of these privileged views, again based on Titian. all very much based on Titian. Venus with a lute player. Now, whether she's definitely Venus because there's Cupid, right? Titian likes to blur the lines sometimes. And our lute player alluding to music as love, as lust, inspired by his song by the goddess of love. And this becomes the basis for another image by Ingres, right? Now, this interest in Orientalism continues. It's not just Napoleon. That's just where it starts for France. It continues and continues through French art, particularly of the 19th century, but even into the 20th century. And that's because of France's political ambitions. Napoleon had conquered Egypt, right? Napoleon had stormed into Palestine, right? But the French were very much interested in colonizing the Mediterranean. And they occupied and colonized Algeria beginning in 1830 and continuing all the way to 1962. That's the Algerian War of Independence from France. It was not a free country, not free of French control until my lifetime, right? And that interest then in depicting the Middle East as a culture that's different from, but in need of Western civilization is a theme that runs rampant through French painting. Right? So here's another image of, again, a harem girl. Extraordinarily erotic. I would argue even more eroticized than the Grand Odalisque is. This is one of a number of variants of the exact same theme that he does. Languidly rolling around, comfortable in her nakedness, and revealing it to us. There are numerous details that add to this idea that this is meant to be seen as a symbol of decadence. Right? In the background, we see more of the harem frolicking around to remind us that he's not monogamous, the harem owner. And there's this complicated thing that happens, right, with these images, because on the one hand, they are saying Middle East uncivilized. It's an Orientalist sort of idea. But on the other hand, they're marketing it to you. You're buying it. Are you then uncivilized for wanting to look at this? For wanting to own it? It's complicated, right, that way. So we see more of the harem girls in the back dancing around this pool, a figure up above keeping guard and a red hat on them, another figure in a turban with them in the background. But that's to remind us that this is one of many women that are members of the harems, of the Sultan's harem. The musician playing for her is another woman, and she's having a little wardrobe malfunction that adds to the eroticism. We see a little bit of her left nipple poking out from behind the dress. Ingres loves realism. There's an extraordinarily realistic and almost documentary sense to the musical instrument with the inlay or those columns on the parapet behind her. These things suggest that this is very, very real, that it's truthful. And that's part of what seems to be the agenda of Orientalist pictures, is not only do they show us a very select thematic range, right? Harem scenes run prevalent, but they also depict it with documentary accuracy to suggest that this is the way it really is, to suggest that Ingres maybe saw this, even though we know he didn't. And then that problem I'm talking about, that this is presented to us to view. There's behind her guard, the eunuch, right? Eunuchs are castrated male guards, so they cannot dally around with the Sultan's women. And you'll notice that he's kind of actively looking away, briefly sort of glancing, but for the most part his head is turned because that's what he's supposed to do. And yet you and me, we get to look directly, right? So this is very much an othering. This is depicting a culture as being different from French culture. and in a way sort of looking down on it. With all of these extraordinary details, it remains an eroticized image, right? An image of the unashamed display of the female body for the harem owner. Right? So Orientalism is a subset of what we're talking about with neoclassicism, right? It's not really its own movement per se, but it falls under this interest in past cultures that get revived within neoclassicism. It comes sort of front-loaded with issues of ideology, issues of a French sense of what it means to be French, and how to justify what's going on in France politically, which includes the colonization of foreign countries through the course of the 19th century. Now we find neoclassicism elsewhere as well. It's not only France. So far we've just been looking at French pictures for neoclassicism, but we find neoclassicism in England particularly strong as well. Here is our second female painter? Third, right, that we've looked at so far, Angelica Kauffmann. Born in Switzerland, emigrated to England, part of the English Royal Academy, and she also, like Jacques-Louis David, looks to images from ancient Rome as allegories for proper behavior in the modern world. And in this case, this is down in Richmond, Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. It shows an image of Cornelia, whose two sons each grew up to be a prefect in Rome during the 2nd century BC. So it's before the empire, right? Leaders of Rome that are elected, which for England is a good thing. Right? And according to history, these two sons of Cornelia each grew up to be a leader, a particularly enlightened leader, a leader who was interested in helping, benefiting the common man during their reign. And so what the picture attempts to do is to show how this morally exemplary behavior of these two Roman emperors, how that value system was instilled in them when they were kids. That they grew up to rule based on how mother had raised them, right? And so Cornelia is shown as the great mother who instills in her children proper values. And the benefit of that is that the values you learn from your mother, right, can become the values that make you a great person as an adult. So the story here, right, is that Cornelia has 3 children. She has a daughter and 2 sons. And she's got a snarky neighbor. Right? And the neighbor is always coming over and sort of bragging about how wealthy she is. And she comes over one day with a box full of jewels and opens them up. And the little daughter begins to play with the jewels. Remember Achilles on Skyros, the Poussin picture? Girls love the jewels, boys love the military stuff. It's very sexist, right? The daughter looks at the jewels, and the woman says, "These are my jewels. This is my prized possessions." "Oh, Cornelia, where are your jewels? You know, you're dressed so plainly, yada, yada, yada." And Cornelia points to her children. "These are my prized possessions. These are my jewels." Right? These are most important thing to me. And so we see her now presenting her children as her jewels, right? As the things she values the most. And it's an image about education. It's an image about child rearing, right? Cornelia presents her children to her neighbor as the results of her hard work, right? The things she values most. And if we read the picture closely, the little kid on the left just kind of looks like an imp. You know, look at the look on his face. He's like a little troll. And there's almost a sense that he's not quite doing the right thing. But you'll notice if you read the picture closely that Cornelia is pointing to the older child. And the older child is behaving. Right? And the older child has the younger, impish child by the wrist, no less. Right? Come on, remember what mom taught us. Behave. Right? Don't jump over there and look at the jewels. They're not that important. There's more important things in life. So it becomes this sort of complex image of maternal education, of how the mother teaches the children and how the mother teaches the older children to school the younger. Right? Not only the role of Cornelia as mother, but the role of the elder child in the education of his brother. These are all very much wrapped up with Enlightenment ideals. At the time that this was painted, many philosophers throughout Europe were talking about education. They're talking about child rearing. They were talking about the older tradition of child rearing, which said that you would send your children away to a wet nurse, to be schooled outside of the home. And they were saying that that was not necessarily the best idea, that the best education, many philosophers, Rousseau is arguing, the best education comes from direct parental contact. That is how you make a good citizenry, is through being schooled and taught by your parents. And this image seems to tie directly into that idea. Cornelia teaches one son, who then teaches the other. But of course it still suffers from the patriarchy, right? The women, the girl is sort of left out of it for now, even though Cornelia is such a strong woman. So, neoclassicism in other countries, right? This idea of an exemplum virtutis, right? These are examples of virtue, drawn from ancient prototypes that talk to us about how to navigate the present day, right? That theme that Voltaire had first talked about spreads beyond France to other countries. We're going to look at two last neoclassical works, one by Copley. He's a British artist as well, another English artist, another member of the English Royal Academy. This particular picture, first, Copley was born in the colonies. He was born in America, but before the Revolution, right? So he's really Brit. And in fact, he was a Tory, a member of the British Loyalist Party. And in 1776, when the War of Independence broke out, Copley moved back to England with his family. In fact, his father was a tea merchant. His father had been attacked during the Boston Tea Party, right? They're very Tory. They're very royalist. And this was painted after Copley had moved back to England, right? But it's a reminiscence of an event that had happened in the Americas. This is Havana Harbor in Cuba. And it shows an event from the early life of Brooke Watson. Now, Brooke Watson, when this was painted, had just become the Lord Mayor of London. He's a member of Parliament. He's a prominent public official, right? And Copley is commissioned to paint an early event from his life, right? To talk about his development as an individual toward this position of power as Lord Mayor of London. And the story is that he was swimming in the Havana Harbor and got attacked by a shark, right? And the first swipe around, the shark got his leg from the knee down. And you can see that Copley kind of cleans it up. It looks like it just goes into the darker water, but you can see if you look more closely, it's not a lot of leg there post-knee, right? He's missing the bottom part of his leg. It's in the shark. And now the shark is swept back around the boat and coming in. It's a huge shark. Look at where its tail is, right? And it's coming back around for the second swipe. And they're desperately trying to save him. And of course, we know this is 1749, this event, right? We know he's still alive, so we know this is going to be successful, but it's highly dramatic, right? And they're trying to rescue him from this extraordinary shark, right? Now, an exemplum virtutis, maybe. The value of working together as a team, what you can achieve when you work together. Black and white, working together as a team. right? That can be certainly an example for us all, that we can achieve more working together than we can working apart. That's a possibility. Other people have suggested that there might be a political metaphor rather than just a simple exemplum virtutis. Brooke Watson is swimming, has lost part of his body. This is 2 years after the Revolution. This symbol of London has lost part of his body. England has lost part of its body. America has split away, has been eaten up by forces from the New World. Could this be a political allegory as well? The lost leg is the Americas left behind. These are all possible readings, right? The big question for us is, what is Watson doing naked? Right? Why is he out there swimming nude? Did the water rip his clothes off? Did he just strip down to go swimming? It's kind of inexplicable nakedness. And the explanation comes not from the narrative, but from this neoclassical idea of looking at past art. Neoclassical artists are always looking to the past for inspirations to drive home the point of the message of the image. So the figure of Brooke Watson in the water goes directly back to a very, very famous Greek statue in the Vatican collection in Rome, showing the priest of the city of Troy who tries to warn the Trojans not to take the horse. And Neptune, the god of the sea, silences him by sending sea monsters to attack him and his sons. And you can see that Brooke Watson's pose borrows from the Laocoon. And it's a perfect example to use for Copley because attacked by the monsters of the sea. Right? Once he gets that metaphor in his head, where's he going to turn? This makes all sorts of sense. Right? So part of the nudity of Brooke Watson can be explained by the ancient prototypes, the classical prototypes that this neoclassical artist is using. I want to point to two more and then we'll quit. The figure at the helm of the boat stabbing at the shark borrows from a Raphael painting. Neoclassical artists are equally interested in the Renaissance, another classical period of history. And just as Michael slays a demon from hell, our figure at the helm of the boat slays a shark. Right? And again, the prototypes that they choose end up helping to amplify the meaning of the scene. Right? And I lost the third one. I have a third image to show, and I'll bring it in on Thursday. So I think we'll quit there. We'll look at the last example on Thursday, and we'll look at one more neoclassical work, and then we'll move on to Romanticism on Thursday. Right? So good luck with your research. Don't put it off until the last minute. That's your really is your next set of things to do.